Behind me are hundreds of exhibitors in the paper and pulp and cardboard industries, all of them selling innovations, many of them in the area of energy conservation, and the rest are looking to improve the productivity, efficiency and cost base of the European paper and pulp and cardboard industries. And that's a real challenge. Worldwide, the situation looks pretty good. We have 1 billion children alive today, all of whom will soon be a part of the consumer age. In places like India, we have a middle class of 200 or 300 million that's going to rise by another 100 or 200 million people every few years, all of them in the market for increased paper and cardboard products. So you might think that the industry is going to look great. But it's also, of course, being hit by very high oil prices, and while today the price is hovering around $135 a barrel, by the time you're watching this video, that price could be very different. And that creates all kinds of challenges for the paper industry in terms of planning. But one thing's for sure, energy is going to be much more of a premium than it was in the early 200s, when we were seeing barrel prices of only around $15 or so. Now, in the European Union, in contrast to the emerging economies, we are of course seeing stable or falling populations. So the fact of the matter is that Europe will be under great pressure to accept increasing immigration, which will offset part of that population decline, and we are indeed seeing that kind of scenario played out in places like the UK. Now, when you balance the stable or falling use of paper and cardboard for all kinds of reasons, of which population is only one in the European Union, with the explosive growth in places like Asia and also Africa, it means that globally we're likely to see on balance around a 2% increase in the revenues for the pulp and paper industry. But it's heavily skewed. For instance, if we look at China, if we look at the average growth rate in paper and pulp consumption from 1985 to 2005, we would see that it's been about 7.6%. That's China compared to India, around 5%. US only 1.3%, and the rest of the world around 3%. But if you look at the annual growth rate in lumber consumption, again, very big differences. China around 8.1%, India 11.1%. That's the use of forestry products. In total, US only 1.9%, again, world 1.5%. That's a five-fold difference between the US and Canada in timber use. Now, again, when we look at places like America, which uses, the average citizen uses 300 kilograms of paper every single year, and that's dropping by around 5 or 6% per year, and that's the same in the European Union. But you compare that with the use of paper in India, which is at a very low base right now. The average citizen in India doesn't use 300 kilograms, it only uses 4 kilograms of paper a year, and it's even less in Africa. There are 20 nations in Africa with a use of paper of only 1 kilogram a year. Now, what we can see is this, that as these countries in Asia and Africa continue to generate economic growth, as the number of middle-class people in these countries aspires and gradually develops Western-style lifestyles, you will see that their use of paper and cardboard will increase dramatically. Now, I'm not saying that in India you're going to get populations using 300 kilograms of paper a year as in the US. After all, the US is becoming more efficient with recycling. The US is on a downward curve, as is the European Union, as is Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the rest. What I am saying is that India will, at the top end, in its wealthy population, certainly achieve a likely target of 100 kilograms of paper per person per year, maybe 150, maybe even 200 kilograms of paper a year. And that's going to be a very different scenario than today, when it's played out in the global market. Now, when we look at particular areas like newsprint, there has been a challenge, especially from things like energy consumption and scarcity of materials, and there's pressures in the market, and the global prices of newsprint have soared. They got up from a low of around $425 per US dollars per ton for 45 GSM newsprint. We've seen, well, it's been getting up to about $800 a ton. That's almost doubling just from around 2002 to early 2008. Now, that's a hefty jump, and into that market that was much more of a domestic market, where the US produced its own newsprint for newspapers, the European Union produced its own rolls, and so on. Now we're seeing these massive rolls being imported from Russia, China, South America and so on. It really is becoming a global market. They're heavy, bulky, but they can be shipped. And there are challenges in terms of getting the right product to the right printer at the right time. But if you can be reasonably confident about how many newspapers you're going to print every day for the next 6 months, then you're in the global market to buy newsprint from just about anywhere you want. But newsprint itself is coming under pressure in developed nations. If we look at US, for instance, newspaper revenues fell 9.4% in 2006-07. That's pretty big, and nearly 10%. At the same time, online revenues grew about 20%. And despite that, that pressure, which means that newspapers can't get the ads, it means that they're having to cut down their size of sheets in the newspaper, or they have to put up their price. In either way, it means the product delivers less value for the customer for the price they're having to pay. At the same time, we've seen magazines survive remarkably well. In fact, only a 1% fall in the first quarter of 2008 in the US market, despite all the economic downturn with the subprime crisis. And books are doing even better. But before we go there, just look at what's happening worldwide on newspapers. Wow, it's true that in places like the UK, Scandinavia, Russia, well, actually Russia's different. Russia newspaper readership is growing, but in the developed nations, we've seen downward pressure on newspaper readership. It's been a mature market, and people have been gradually moving from newspapers to online. That's certainly not the case in a place like India, which has a staggering total of 5,500 newspapers in print already, and 25 million new readers of newspapers or magazines in the last 2 years, just in one country. I know it's a big one of 1.3 billion people. But the fact is, loads and loads, hundreds of millions of people in India read, but only occasionally. But what they're doing is they're cultivating a habit, a lifetime habit, perhaps, of reading regularly lots of stuff about current affairs, and that's why the newspapers and magazines are doing so well. Now, we'll see consolidation, I'm sure, in the newspaper market. We'll see many of those 5,500 titles will disappear. They'll be replaced by others. There'll be a certain amount of churn. But 25 million new readers in 24 months is a spectacular achievement. That's just over 1 million a month, and we can expect that to continue for the next 10, 15 or 20 years in India. Now, in terms of the digital society, people often say, well, surely the online world is going to destroy all of that. Well, yes, it will, perhaps, but not quite as rapidly as you might think. For a start, many of these paper products have quite an emotional appeal, and they're very practical. You can touch them, you can write on them, you can scribble on them, you can tear bits out, you can pop them in your pocket. Paper does have advantages, which is why the so-called paperless office has been so long coming. In fact, if you look at surveys of email use and paper use in large companies worldwide over the last 10 years, you will see that paper use has actually increased rather than decreased in most of them. Strange? Well, the fact of the matter is that people print things out. They only print a very small proportion of their emails out, but as emails have gone through the roof in terms of volume, so paper has been surprisingly long-lasting. Now, set that against the Economist's prediction, which was that the only use of paper that will survive digital revolution perhaps would be Kleenex to blow your nose or to wipe your bottom when you go to the toilet. Well, quite honestly, I think that's wide of the mark. And when you look at the actual realities, you find that, as I say, paper has quite a strong emotional pull. And having said that, you look, for instance, at Yellow Pages and the directories industry, they're under pressure from people like Google Maps. If you look at direct mail and the rather mindless marketing of millions of people, again, that's under pressure in terms of cost and lowering response rates.